So thank you all for coming to the launch of Zimbabwe's Land Reform Myths and Realities, and a special thanks to the Royal African Society for hosting it, and Stephen and for chairing, and panellists for coming along to say a few words. The book, as you know, is published by James Curry in the UK, but importantly, particularly importantly for us as the authors, it's also available in Zimbabwe through Weaver Press, and very soon, in the coming weeks, through Jacana in South Africa. The book has been long in the making. It's been a 10-year project involving many people. Its genesis was actually before 2000, when we were working in Masvingo province on changing livelihood strategies, including Sabona, Joseph Chaumba, Will Walmer, and a variety of others. And we were working there, and then came 2000, those major events of that year, and the land invasion started. Now, as researchers interested in agrarian change, we just couldn't ignore what was happening around us. And we started, beginning then, to document what was going on, first around Chiredzi and then more broadly across the whole of Masvingo province. And for someone who, like me, who'd worked on rural development issues in Zimbabwe for, embarrassingly now, 25 years, someone who thought he knew Masvingo rural areas pretty well, I learned a lot and had to unlearn a lot in the coming months and years. At that time, no one really knew what changes the land reform would bring to the overall agrarian structure of the country. I don't think anyone thought that it would be such a radical change. But by 2010, under what became the fast-track land reform, between 8 and 9 million hectares, formerly around 4,000 large-scale farms, have been transferred, benefiting over 1 million people in 170,000 approximately households. 146,000 of those households are in so-called A1 smallholder schemes, and around 23,000 households are part of A2 small-scale commercial farms. In addition, there are still informal settlements not recognised by the government programme, and the overall area is substantial, amounting to around a quarter of the country's total land area, and within Masvingo province, around 30% of the province. So this is important to get the scale of this in mind. Before giving a brief overview of some of the findings, I want to acknowledge a few people. Obviously the core team, the co-authors of the book. 3 of the authors, Blasio Mavadzenge, Felix Murimba, and Jacob Maheni, are farmers. Farmers based in different parts of Masvingo, but also researchers. And I've been researching together with them since the early 90s. 2, Nelson Marongwe and Chris Sukume, are based, or at least linked to, the University of Zimbabwe, based in Harare. It's a great team. It was a fantastic privilege to work with this group of people. We had heated debates and continue to have heated debates about our findings and the implications of them. I'd also like to acknowledge a few other people who helped in the process, not least the many farmers who were involved in the discussions over these years about our findings. And indeed the first book launches, this is only about the 15th book launch, the first 10 to 15 book launches were in the field sites themselves in late November, early December. In Masvingo we had many people to debate with, but particularly our colleagues in agri-techs, technical people concerned with agriculture, and whose provincial head in Masvingo, Nyasha Pambirai, has been a long supporter of solid empirical research in the province. And finally I should acknowledge the funding. The funding came in part through the ESRC and DFID programme on poverty, and was coordinated by Professor Ben Cousins, who's based at PLAS at UWC in South Africa. So what do we do in this work? We set out to answer a very simple question. What happened to people's livelihoods once they got land through land reform? Now, of course, if you dig beneath the surface of such a simple question, it's not so simple after all, and it requires some quite sophisticated answers. And I hope we provided some of them in the book. We conducted our research across 16 sites had a sample of 400 households on the new resettlements, A1, A2 and informal settlements across Masvingo province, in a transect from the relatively higher potential areas in Gutu Chatsworth and the dry low veld in around Chikumbedzi, if you know the province. What we found was often unexpected and surprising. It confounded in many ways and complicated in many ways the media stereotypes which were constantly being projected. The results tell a story which, as Stephen said, is complex and nuanced. So what did we find? First, we found that the land reform in Masvingo wasn't the unmitigated disaster that is sometimes portrayed. There were both successes and, of course, failures. Indeed, around about half of all the farmers in our sample were, in our terms, accumulating from below. That means making surpluses from agriculture and investing them back into the agricultural production system, generating both income and employment. In terms of farm labour, we found a substantial hiring in of both temporary and permanent labour from surrounding areas. Compared to the beef ranches, which largely preceded these new settlements, which employed relatively few people, the new farms were generating employment. Poorly paid, limited labour rights for sure, but nevertheless a source of livelihood for many. Overall, these patterns of accumulation from below were more evident in the smallholder A1 schemes, where very often a vibrant farm-based economy was emerging. By contrast, the A2 farms, small-scale commercial farms, with some notable exception, it must be said, had found it more difficult to get established under the very difficult economic conditions of the past decade. We found also that agriculture hadn't completely collapsed, as is sometimes assumed, but certainly it had been transformed. Echoing the national pattern, there were declines in certain commodities, including maize to some extent, definitely wheat and some of the estate crops like sugar. But there was also remarkable stability in some crops, notably cotton, that has become an important crop for the new resettlements in our study areas. And there was also substantial growth in other commodities, for example, traditional smallholder crops such as small grains, groundnuts, edible beans and so on. Certainly room for improvement, no question, but and yields have remained relatively low, and in part because of input supply, seeds, fertilizers and so on, has been severely hampered. But while the crop mixes change and problems remain, there's been both resilience and a slow pattern of recovery in the agricultural sector. Third, we found that food insecurity remains a problem for some, for sure, but it wasn't quite as widespread as sometimes reported. In our research, we tracked crop production, and especially food grains, over 7 consecutive years from 2002. Indeed, the tracking is continuing now. And this showed, as people cleared land, established farms, production increased. Yes, it was highly variable between people and between years, but the proportion of households producing more than a ton of maize in a year, an amount sufficient to feed an average family for a whole year, steadily increased. For example, following the 2009 harvest, between 2/3 and 100% of households across our sample, depending on the site, had sufficient food for their needs. And indeed, around 1/3 of all households regularly sold their surplus, both locally and more broadly, often through informal channels. Indeed, for agriculture more generally, whether for production or marketing, the national level statistics, which are often reported, and so many of the claims about food insecurity are often simply not capturing what's happening at the local level. The old ways of measuring things were insufficient for the new transformed agricultural system. What else did we find? We found that the new farms were not dominated by so-called cronies, big debate in the Zimbabwe setting. By far the majority, over 2/3 of new settlers were ordinary people, around half of all new settlers in our sites coming from nearby communal areas. These were asset poor and income poor people in need of land. There were others, of course, former farm workers, civil servants, business people and so on. And we argue that this wider mix of people in the rural areas results in a greater diversity of skills, of experiences, connections in these settings. And then, of course, there were the so-called cronies. numerically small in number, but of course disproportionately influential in the politics of land, and concentrated in the A2 sites. We estimated that around 5% of the land beneficiaries in our sample could be associated with this category. So overall then, it's a very complex picture, but not one that reflects standard media commentary in any way. Also, contrary to expectations, we found that there was much investment going on in the new resettlements. Clearing of land, building of homes, digging of wells, purchasing of farm equipment, growing herds and flocks of livestock, and so on. Most of this was private investment, without support from outside. Community level too, there was considerable group effort focused on building schools, constructing dams, cutting roads, for example. And for individual household level investment, we estimated, again across our sample, that each household on average had invested the equivalent of $2,000 in getting their operations going. Extrapolate that across the whole province, across all resettlement areas, that adds up to a total of $90 million. That's no mean sum in total investment in these new areas. Compare that with the vanishingly small investments by the state and the absence of any donors and NGO support in the resettlements. It certainly again challenges the assumption that nothing is happening, that the land lies idle and unused. We found too that off-farm economic and entrepreneurial activity was vibrant. The rural economy had not collapsed. Operating under very difficult circumstances for sure, especially in that period of hyperinflation to 2009, nevertheless, lots was happening. Again, very often under the radar. The net result has been the economic activity has shifted to new value chains, located in new places, involving new people. The old economy is certainly in decline, but a new one is emerging on the margin, sometimes illegal, often fragile, never measured, and so again, not reflected in the statistics. We've also found much else besides, but you're going to have to buy and read the book to find out more. So what have been some of the critiques of our work? And there has been a substantial debate already generated by the publication of the book. First, there's an argument that Masvingo is unrepresentative and an inappropriate choice of study focus. Well, as a case study, of course, data from Masvingo cannot tell the full story of Zimbabwe's land reform, of course. But we argue that it's a significant province in many respects and tells an important, untold story relevant to the semi-arid regions of the country, indeed, the geographical majority. We've been careful to point out, however, that our sites do not include any of those very highly capitalised farms with large populations of farm labour, like those which were taken over in the high veld. Here a different story certainly did unfold. But even here, as other studies are now showing, resource-poor people did benefit, and particularly in the A1 farms, and the broader, more positive story still holds. Second, some claim that our sample was biased and that we did not cover all the dimensions. My response to this is simply that others must carry out their own empirical work and more is happening already. Our sampling actually was done very carefully. We chose clusters of sites where there were A1 and A2 areas close by to allow comparisons and to explore interactions. And we sampled across an agroecological gradient to get a wide variety of settings. And we included cases such as the sugar estates in Hippo Valley, which offer a broader picture of different production systems. And a detailed insight into a population of 400 households over much of a decade is not a minor study by most calculations. Third, some people have argued that we have set up a series of myths which are only straw people, easy to shoot down, and that in fact no one believes these myths anyway. Well, I beg to differ. The myths about Zimbabwe's land reform are alive and well and continue to be peddled almost on a daily basis in the media, by academic commentators, by donors and many others. Often in very respectable places by perfectly reputable people, yet without any grounding in solid empirical field data. These myths, I would still argue, definitely, urgently need challenging with empirical realities from the ground. Fourth, some say we have not addressed the wider abuses, corruption, violence that have been associated with land reform. This, I'm afraid, is simply untrue. We've been very careful in the book to offer a balanced and rounded picture, and we pointed out problems and shortcomings where they've been found. And finally, for those who really find it difficult to engage in constructive debate and have not really bothered to read our material, I've been accused of being stupid, ignorant, foolish, and my favourite, a politically correct twerp. And probably there's more in Stephen's email. One email subject line simply had, "You are a bag of shit," followed by a completely incomprehensible rant. And in a blog piece on a usually very good website, we were called apologists of a tyrannical regime posing as researchers. To these people and others, I'd argue that the challenge now is to address the empirical realities on the ground, to debate the findings rigorously and transparently, and seek a way forward for policy based on evidence, not emotion or ideological posturing. What we're interested to do overall in the book is look forward, not back. Everyone agrees that land reform was necessary in Zimbabwe. Most agree that it should have happened earlier and in a more orderly and transparent way. Now we're confronted with a new agrarian structure, with new people on the land, new patterns of production and economy. The big question is, what to do now? Whether in Zimbabwe, within government, among donors and embassies, across the political parties, or in civil society, or internationally, in the media, in academic circles, or within diaspora networks, I'd argue that the debate on land and agrarian issues has actually been rather poor, sometimes almost actively, consciously avoiding empirical evidence. Yet, this is such a critical issue for the future, and we urgently need to define a new narrative on land and livelihoods in Zimbabwe, based on the realities on the ground, not supposition, posturing, or fabrication. The good news is that we now have a growing body of evidence available. This study is one of amongst many. For example, the very important work by the Residual Trust in Mazoe, Shamba, and Mangwe, the 6 district studies by the African Institute for Agrarian Studies, both excellent research groups based in Harare. What's more, there are now numerous smaller studies carried out by Zimbabwean students and others documenting what's going on. For example, the 15 very excellent pieces which I commend to you, we supported under the Livelihoods After Land Reform Small Grants Fund, as well as numerous MA and PhD studies in training. With this growing body of evidence, a wider, more complex story must be told, drawing out this vitally important policy implications for the future. We hope this book is just one small contribution to a more informed debate on this critical issue for Zimbabwe's future. Thank you.